Within every human interaction lies an unseen layer, a dimension that most of us avoid confronting. It is the hidden part of the psyche, the shadow that carries the traits, fears, and impulses we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The shadow is not evil in itself, but it is powerful in its capacity to shape behavior when left unexamined. In relationships with individuals who seek to dominate or control, particularly those with narcissistic tendencies, the shadow often becomes most visible, not in the overt actions of the narcissist alone, but in the way their presence reflects the parts of ourselves we have denied. When a narcissist engages with you, their role is often to provoke reactions, to mirror back a distorted reflection of your vulnerabilities. They thrive on eliciting fear, guilt, insecurity, or anger, emotions that are typically tied to the shadow elements we do not wish to confront. Their behavior acts as a psychological magnifying glass. Suddenly, your own denied tendencies, your suppressed doubts, or your unacknowledged desires appear more vividly against the backdrop of their manipulation. In other words, their dominance is only effective because it triggers the unintegrated parts of your own psyche. The moment a narcissist realizes you have cultivated peace within yourself, a profound shift occurs. The mirror they once used to project chaos and uncertainty back into your life begins to fail. Their strategies no longer elicit the reactions they depend upon. You begin to recognize that the discomfort they provoke is not entirely theirs. It is a reflection of the shadow elements you have resisted. By stepping into awareness, you illuminate these shadows. You see them for what they are, fragments of yourself waiting for integration, not tools for punishment or control. This revelation, however, is uncomfortable for the narcissist. They are accustomed to the world bending to their image of control, to encounters where your reactions feed their self-perception. When you no longer respond in predictable ways, when your inner serenity does not waver at their attempts to dominate, they encounter resistance not only externally, but internally. Your peace becomes a mirror of their own shadow, the parts of themselves they cannot admit, the voids they have hidden beneath grandiose facades. They are confronted by the very instability they rely upon to define their own sense of importance. The shadow revealed is not only a psychological concept, it is a lived experience. It manifests in moments when silence replaces reaction, when calm replaces fear, when confidence replaces insecurity. The narcissist's discomfort grows because their identity depends on the projection of power onto others. When that projection fails, their shadow, their unacknowledged vulnerabilities, the fragility masked by arrogance, emerges. The more you inhabit your own wholeness, the more their illusions crumble, not because you have sought to dismantle them, but because the integrity of your inner life no longer permits distortion to take root. This dynamic underscores a profound truth about human psychology. What we resist in ourselves is often what we unconsciously seek to provoke in others. The shadow is not only a personal challenge, but a relational one. In the presence of someone who manipulates or dominates, the shadow can be triggered externally, making it appear as though the other person is the source of turmoil. Yet the real source lies in the unexamined fragments within, those aspects of the psyche that have yet to be reconciled. By observing these moments, by recognizing the reflections cast by the narcissist behavior, one gains the opportunity to integrate the shadow, to reclaim the parts of self that were previously projected outward. In this process, there is both liberation and tension. Liberation, because the act of recognizing the shadow allows for conscious choice rather than an unconscious reaction. Tension, because the narcissist now confronts a reality in which their power is diminished, where their projections meet resistance, and where the reflection of their own hidden self cannot be ignored. Human development is often misunderstood as a linear journey defined by external achievements or societal milestones. Yet the most profound transformation occurs within, in the quiet and sometimes tumultuous process of becoming an integrated self. This process, which we might call individuation, is the emergence of a fully realized individual who is aware of their inner world, who can distinguish between authentic desires and external impositions, and who can navigate relationships without losing their sense of identity. Individuation is not merely self-discovery. It is the ongoing act of reclaiming one's consciousness from patterns of dependency, manipulation, and projection that have shaped life without awareness. In the presence of a narcissistic individual, the process of individuation is tested and revealed. Narcissists often seek to absorb the attention, energy, and identity of those around them, creating a dynamic in which the other person's sense of self becomes entangled with the narcissist's needs. The struggle, however, is not only about resisting control, it is about recognizing that the self can exist independently of the validation or approval that has previously defined it. Individuation triumphs when a person consciously differentiates their inner life from external pressures, reclaiming the sovereignty of thought, feeling, and intention. This differentiation begins with awareness. It requires noticing patterns of reaction that were previously automatic, the irritation that flares in response to criticism, the fear of abandonment, the compulsion to placate or appease. Each reactive impulse holds a message about the shadow, the unacknowledged fears, desires, and vulnerabilities within. By observing these impulses rather than acting on them reflexively, the individual begins to separate the authentic self from the influence of the narcissist. In doing so, they claim the authority to decide how they will think, feel, and act, rather than surrendering these decisions to someone else's manipulations. The triumph of individuation is also visible in emotional regulation. A narcissist thrives on chaos and instability. They depend on the emotional turbulence they can evoke in others to reinforce their sense of power. Yet as individuation strengthens, emotional responses shift from reaction to reflection. When provoked, the individuated self can pause, recognize the source of the agitation, and respond with intentionality rather than compulsion. This shift signals the presence of an internal center that is autonomous, stable, and resilient, a center that no longer bends to external pressure or manipulation. Individuation also manifests in the cultivation of personal values and boundaries. The individuated self does not conform out of fear, obligation, or desire for approval. Instead, decisions are guided by conscious principles, personal ethics, and authentic needs. Boundaries are no longer defensive walls hastily erected in response to external threats. They are deliberate structures that preserve the integrity of the self. In interactions with a narcissist, these boundaries become evident as a refusal to engage in games of control, a clarity about what is acceptable, and an unwillingness to compromise core identity for the comfort or desire of another. Moreover, individuation involves the reconciliation of inner contradictions. The individuated self does not seek perfection, but accepts complexity strength coexisting with vulnerability, confidence alongside uncertainty, compassion alongside firmness. This acceptance reduces the power of external forces to destabilize, because the self no longer relies solely on external affirmation. Narcissistic attempts to provoke insecurity meet a grounded presence, a psyche that has acknowledged its own imperfections without judgment and has chosen autonomy over submission. Triumph in individuation is not a static state, but an ongoing dynamic. It requires constant attention to inner life, continual reflection on motivations, and a willingness to confront the aspects of self that remain unintegrated. Each moment of awareness and choice reinforces the separation between self and external influence, between authentic identity and imposed narrative, between the power of the individuated mind and the illusions of control projected by others in human relationships. The mind often operates in ways that are hidden from conscious awareness. One of the most profound mechanisms at play is projection. The tendency to attribute to others the feelings, desires, or traits that one cannot acknowledge in oneself. Projection is a mirror, but a distorted one. It reflects internal conflicts outward, making them appear as qualities, flaws, or intentions in other people. When encountering individuals who exhibit narcissistic tendencies, projection becomes not only a personal phenomenon, but a relational tool, a means through which control and influence are exerted. Yet the very act of recognizing projection can transform it, turning what was once a source of manipulation into a lens of insight and empowerment. A narcissist often projects their own insecurities, fears, and unacknowledged needs onto those around them. In doing so, they create a narrative in which the other person appears flawed, dependent, or deficient. This externalization serves to protect the narcissist from facing the uncomfortable truths within themselves: vulnerability, inadequacy, or a lack of authentic selfhood. By projecting onto others, they maintain the illusion of superiority and control. For the recipient of these projections, however, the experience can be destabilizing. It can create doubt, confusion, and an exaggerated sense of responsibility for someone else's emotions or perceptions. Recognition of projection is the key to liberation. It begins with self-awareness, the capacity to notice emotional reactions, patterns of thought, and physical responses as they arise in interaction with the narcissist. When anger, guilt, or shame emerges, pausing to ask, "Whose issue is this really?" allows the individuated self to separate personal reality from the reflected distortions of another. This recognition does not involve denial of one's own feelings. Rather, it is an acknowledgement that the intensity or focus of the emotion may be amplified by another's projection. In this space, discernment emerges, creating a buffer between the projected content and one's authentic experience. Projection also serves as a profound teacher. By observing what a narcissist projects onto you, it becomes possible to infer aspects of their inner world that remain hidden from them. Every criticism, every attempt to provoke, every manipulation is a reflection of their unintegrated self. What they cannot bear to see within themselves is cast outward, highlighting the traits or fears they refuse to confront. In this sense, projection acts as a psychological map, revealing not only the internal conflicts of the narcissist, but also the areas of your own psyche that may be triggered by unresolved vulnerabilities. Recognition of projection thus becomes a dual process, seeing clearly what belongs to another and noticing what unresolved elements in oneself have been activated The power of recognition lies in its capacity to disarm manipulation. Once you can identify a projected criticism or accusation as external rather than intrinsic, its emotional grip diminishes. The narcissist's attempt to define your reality loses force because it is no longer unconsciously accepted. Boundaries are reinforced, choices are clarified, and responses become deliberate rather than reactive. This shift changes the dynamic of the relationship. The narcissist encounters someone who sees through the projections, someone whose internal world remains sovereign, unshaken by distorted reflections. Recognition also fosters empathy of a subtle, informed kind. Understanding that projection is a defense mechanism rather than purely malice allows for compassionate detachment. You see the struggles of another psyche, their inability to face themselves fully without sacrificing your own peace. In this way, projection and recognition together cultivate both clarity and resilience. The individuated self, aware of the mechanisms at play, can navigate interactions with discernment, responding in alignment with truth rather than reflex, with autonomy rather than dependency, and with inner steadiness rather than reactionary turbulence. Inner peace is one of the most understated yet transformative forces in human experience. It is not the absence of conflict, the denial of difficulty, or a passive retreat from life's challenges. Instead, it is an active, deliberate cultivation of harmony within oneself, a state of consciousness in which clarity, calm, and resilience coexist with the natural fluctuations of emotion and circumstance. Inner peace emerges when a person has learned to navigate the external world without surrendering control over their internal landscape, and it becomes a source of profound strength, particularly in the presence of individuals who seek to dominate, manipulate, or unsettle. For those who have lived under the influence of a narcissist, the discovery of inner peace represents a subtle but radical shift. Narcissists often thrive on the turbulence they can evoke in others. Anger, anxiety, fear, and self-doubt are the fuels of their influence, and the more responsive a person is to these manipulations, the greater the narcissist's sense of power. Inner peace interrupts this dynamic. It is a quiet, immovable center that refuses to be shaken by external provocations, and in this way, it transforms the balance of psychological power. What was once a relationship dominated by reaction now becomes one navigated with intentionality. The cultivation of inner peace requires self-awareness. It begins with an honest observation of thought patterns, emotional triggers, and habitual responses. Recognizing where the mind is ensnared by fear, resentment, or compulsion allows the individuated self to intervene before being swept into reactivity. Breathing, reflection, mindfulness, and the conscious redirection of attention are tools through which this awareness is strengthened. Each moment of choice, however small, reinforces the realization that emotional life is not simply dictated by external circumstances, but is shaped by the conscious engagement of the self. Inner peace also derives its power from acceptance, not resignation, but a clear acknowledgement of reality. And one can see situations and people as they are, without distortion, exaggeration, or the compulsion to control outcomes. The mind is liberated from unnecessary struggle. Narcissistic attempts to provoke, manipulate, or intimidate encounter a consciousness that does not respond with fear or compulsion. Instead, there is clarity, recognition of influence without submission, awareness of threat without panic. This acceptance does not require agreement or intimacy With the narcissist's worldview, it only requires the sovereign assertion of one's own inner terrain. Another dimension of inner peace is the alignment of action with integrity. When thoughts, words, and behaviors are guided by conscious principles rather than reactive impulses, inner harmony deepens. This integrity reinforces boundaries naturally, not as defensive walls erected in haste, but as expressions of a coherent, self-directed life. The narcissist may attempt to challenge or dismantle these boundaries, but inner peace renders such efforts largely ineffective because the emotional responses they once relied upon are no longer accessible. Peace becomes both shield and compass, protection against manipulation, and a guide toward choices that nurture autonomy and wholeness. Furthermore, inner peace allows for emotional resilience. Life inevitably presents conflict, disappointment, and loss. In the absence of inner stability, these experiences can trigger disproportionate responses, amplifying stress and reinforcing dependency on external validation. In contrast, a person who has cultivated peace carries within them a capacity for equilibrium that tempers the impact of external turbulence. Emotional storms pass without derailing consciousness, and the mind retains the ability to respond with clarity rather than react with confusion. The power of inner peace extends beyond the self. It radiates into relationships, shaping interactions with firmness, compassion, and discernment. In the presence of a narcissist, this radiance is especially potent, for it signals a refusal to participate in cycles of control, projection, or chaos. The serenity of one individual becomes a subtle yet unyielding force, demonstrating that influence is not measured by intimidation or coercion, but by the depth of one's engagement with one's own authentic self. Separation is rarely simple, especially in relationships where attachment has been shaped by manipulation, control, or emotional dependence. The act of stepping away from a person who has dominated your psychological and emotional landscape is often met with ambivalence, guilt, or fear. Yet within the tension of separation lies a profound opportunity for transformation. By creating distance from influences that obscure authenticity, the self is afforded space to evolve, clarify, and assert its inherent autonomy. This transformation is not merely the absence of another's presence, but the active cultivation of independence, integrity, and self-determination. In relationships with narcissistic individuals, separation carries particular significance. Narcissists construct a relational reality in which others are extensions of their identity, mirrors reflecting their desires and insecurities. To remain entwined in such dynamics is to participate in a narrative that diminishes the autonomy of the self. Separation, then, becomes an act of reclaiming authority over one's own life. It allows the individuated self to disentangle from patterns of reaction, to observe previously unconscious influences, and to choose behaviors that are aligned with inner values rather than external compulsion. The act of stepping away is simultaneously an act of courage and clarity, a declaration that identity and well-being will no longer be negotiated under the weight of another's need for control. Transformation through separation begins internally. The individual must confront the complexity of emotions that arise: relief, guilt, fear, anger, sadness, and sometimes even residual affection. Each of these emotions is valid and significant, but none should dictate decisions unconsciously. Reflection and self-awareness become essential tools, allowing one to understand not only the impact of the narcissist's behavior, but also the underlying vulnerabilities that may have enabled entanglement. This self-examination is not about blame, it is about comprehension, growth, and the conscious cultivation of resilience. One of the most profound aspects of this transformation is the realization that identity is self-generated rather than conferred. During entangled relationships, the sense of self is often shaped in reaction to the other's projections, manipulations, and expectations. Separation disrupts this dynamic, revealing that personal meaning, self-worth, and emotional stability are internal resources not dependent on external validation. As the individuated self claims these resources, patterns of fear, dependence, and reactive behavior begin to dissolve, replaced by intentionality, clarity, and inner authority. Separation also allows for a recalibration of relational perception. Without the constant influence of the narcissist, one can observe past interactions with greater clarity and recognize the strategies, projections, and distortions that were previously normalized. This perspective fosters discernment, enabling one to identify unhealthy dynamics, establish boundaries, and navigate future relationships with awareness rather than impulse. The individuated self learns not only to disengage from toxicity, but also to engage selectively and consciously with individuals and experiences that support growth rather than diminish it. Furthermore, transformation through separation is not solely an internal process. It manifests in behavior, communication, and presence. The freedom gained through distance allows one to interact with the world from a place of authenticity rather than compulsion. Decisions become guided by principle rather than fear. Actions reflect integrity rather than manipulation, and emotional responses are measured rather than reflexive. In this way, separation becomes both protective and generative, dismantling old constraints while fostering new patterns of empowerment. This transformation also challenges the narcissist indirectly. By withdrawing from influence, the individuated self disrupts the relational feedback loop that once reinforced the narcissist's sense of control. Their projections, demands, and attempts at manipulation encounter resistance not through confrontation, but through absence, stability, and the unshakable presence of self-possession. In effect, the transformation catalyzed by separation is simultaneously a personal evolution and a subtle, non-violent restructuring of relational dynamics, demonstrating that autonomy, clarity, and inner authority cannot be imposed externally